Chaim Levracha.
Good evening. I think all the thank yous have been said. Of course, our voices go in unison with thanking everyone who made tonight's event possible. But
They actually literally go in unison now.
Yeah, let's do it. Thank you. And really, how does one even begin? You know?
I wish we had thought about this.
We didn't think about that, right? In talking about Michael Alpert and the multiple worlds he continually crosses, some ideas. The idea of a web. It's a network of connections, people, places, ideas, and also, as I hope will emerge tonight, a constellation. So not just a web, but really we're going to try and pinpoint some of the lights in our sky tonight. But really, how does one even begin? You know, sometimes I try and count. I don't know. Well, it's like not even the joke about my grandfather who spoke 17 languages, but only in Yiddish. If you count Michael's, he actually speaks all of them, right? I heard him once in an elevator in Manhattan. Somebody walked into the elevator. I think they just breathed, and he said, "Wait, which part of South Africa are you from?" And I swear I saw him learn Italian while being asleep on a car. Driving from Milan to Pisa. We're going to a festival in Pisa, and he landed from New York. He was jet lagged. He fell asleep. We drove. He woke up and he was speaking Italian. He was not speaking Italian. So I think just breathing. You know, I kept the windows. It was, you know, just warm enough. I kept the windows a little open. So I guess just breathing the air, right? That happened. But you know, also we're talking about like pretty amazing mnemonic powers, and most importantly, as it will emerge just now, growing up, sort of skipping a generation. So there are all kinds of little elements, and I'd like to stay away from the, although I played a few anecdotes, stay away from the anecdote, and really try and pinpoint what is it that we are talking about. The one sort of literary quotation that comes to mind in describing all of this tonight is, has no connection with the Jews. It's Julio Cortázar, you know, a fantastic book entitled La Vuelta del Día en 80 Mundos, around the world, around the day in 80 worlds, right? So that's a little bit what we're going to do. And then an acronym that Michael taught me in these last few days. We've been spending several hours a day reminiscing and pinpointing ideas, but an acronym in English, VCN, a vast and curious network. The first question I had for Michael while thinking about this program and as an ideal complement to Mark's lecture was, well, let's talk about the first Yiddish song that you've ever learned. And of course that was a self-defeating question, because the first Yiddish song is a song in many languages, right? Michael grew up in two places almost simultaneously between the West Coast, and some words should be spent about the West Coast connections of the Klezmer revival, and perhaps we will. But he grew up both on the West Coast in Los Angeles and in the Boston area, and in a family in which several languages were all spoken and lived and sung all at once, although he says he came from a family of tone-deaf Hasidim. So we decided to start.
Because they were spoken simultaneously, sort of, no one heard each other.
Yeah. To start sort of from this idea of growing up with many different sounds and many different languages all at once. Right? Yeah, you go for that.
Okay, this is actually the first song that I remember was, of course, Unter Michael's Vigale, sitzt da weiße Ziegale, Roschingis mit Mandle, wetter gehen, handeln, weiter rein. Das ist das Treffen mit der schönen Kalle und der feine Mischproche.
The Sachgeld?
Mama?
With a Sachgeld?
My family, they hadn't bought into the you know, you need to have enough money to live, alamai, yes. But, yeah. Not that no one ever mentioned money, but anyway, actually, my family came from Russia talking about funding. The song that's one of the first songs that I remember knowing from my family, because we somehow I was born into this remarkable extended family. When I say my family, I refer to my extended family, and in fact the community around them, both in Los Angeles and in New England, the Boston area particularly. I feel like I had the privilege of growing up in this anachronistic slice of Jews from the western borderlands of the late Russian Empire. But it was in the late 1950s and 1960s. And of course I'm still growing up, so but songs like this were common. Oy vuidi gesale vuidi stub vuidi meidale vosich libob oti di gesale oti di stub oti di meidale vosich libob chomliv oti di gesale oti di stub Ой, ты di meidale восихо блив, ой, где же эта улица, где же это дом? This is Russian, by the way. Где же эта девушка, что я влюблен? Вот эта улица, вот это дом. Вот эта девушка, что я влюблен, ой, вот эта улица, вот этот дом, вот эта девушка, что я влюблен. In Polish, где есть та девчина, где есть ten дом? Нет, где есть та улица, где есть ten дом, где есть та девчина, co kocham ja. Otóż ta ulica, otóż ten dom, otóż ta dziewczyna, co kocham ja. Otóż ta ulica, otóż ten dom, otóż ta dziewczyna, co kocham ja. I tak dalej. Nazywajcie.
Yiddish and Polish and Russian, and then of course Lithuanian, right?
Yes. Right. Which, Yiddish, Russian, and Polish were the big ones in that order, just like in the song. There's a certain interesting hierarchy of them. And, right, there was, my parents' generation, on my father's side, all spoke Lithuanian well, which was unusual for Jews that came from Eastern Lithuania. But it was because they were backwoods Jews from the backwoods of Vilna, not from the Jerusalem of Lithuania, but the outlying parts of kind of Rancho Jerusalem, Lithuania. There was one song that I remember. I never learned Lithuanian well. But I know enough in Lithuania today to say, I'm sorry, I don't really speak Lithuanian well. Could we speak Polish or Russian? But we sang also, there's a very famous Russian romance, but we sang it first in Lithuanian and then Russian. Teперь было гаражи, ширдесь не потырс, о села не покинс. Памелео таве, памелео корштай, а toujours rimane, Tei per te, шалатай. Как была эта ночь, так была хороша. Не болела бы грудь, не страдала душа. Полюбил я ее, полюбил горячо, а она на меня смотрит так холодно.
Think about all these languages and then growing up in Los Angeles. And Michael was telling me the other day how he didn't know any other kids who spoke Yiddish in Los Angeles. And family friends either had no children or they had older children. And then he said he finally met a girl who spoke Yiddish, but she was the daughter of survivors. And she really didn't like the language. She really despised his sound. And however, the whole immigrant milieu of Los Angeles really attracted you to a whole network of ethnic and subcultures of the West Coast that are equally important in the constellation we're trying to describe. So, growing up with Jewish survivors in Los Angeles, but also very close to Japanese friends who were coming out of the camps after
whose parents
coming out of the camps, etc. And at the same time learning the violin from an old immigrant teacher, and kind of not really liking that, although music was important in your upbringing, and your mother was a pianist, and so music was part of the constellation, of course. But Yiddish was important in your upbringing with the Yiddish Schule, and spending Sundays in this context, so there is a whole network of songs and a whole repertoire that comes out of that. But at the same time, there is like a chicanismo that starts to emerge in the early days of your life and then comes back when you return to Los Angeles later. So I think we're going to do this sort of interesting medley of Yiddish Schule songs, followed by a song in Spanish that Michael composed as a love song to Los Angeles.
Yes, I had the privilege of going or being sent, sometimes being dragged, to both to shul and to shule. And you get the difference, one being shul being, of course, synagogue, and shul being the Yiddishest secular school where we were taught Jewish history. Yiddish, in this case, different from New York. That's the whole, I guess that's part of this whole narrative, is that I am really in no way, shape, or form a New York Jew. Sarah Felder, please forgive me. But though I've lived there for officially for the last 34 years, and many people think of me as a New Yorker, I think I can find my way through Queens and the Bronx and stuff like that, you know, not just Manhattan. But in any case, yeah, and the Yiddish shul, which was really was a shul that was run by, although it wasn't identified as such, was run by members of and staffed by teachers from the IKUF, the Yiddish Kulturverband, who were the really Yiddishist communists who had broken with the Soviet Union beginning in 1948 and certainly by 1953. So we learned songs such as, for example, Yud Lamed Peretz's words to Beethoven's Ode to Joy. And I know this in Esperanto, actually. I'm not going to say it. Some of you were there at the concert in Berkeley where I did this a few years ago. Believe me, it was a historical accident. But, for example, Alle Menschen seine Brüder, Bräune, gelbe, schwarze, weiße, Völker, Lande und Klimaten, sie sah ausgetrachte Meische, alle Menschen seine Brüder, misch die Farben mois zusammen, alle Menschen seine Brüder, von den Taten, von den Mammen. Which for the Yiddish impaired is thanks. It's, you know, all people are brothers. The peoples, countries, climates are all just a story that's been dreamed up, mixed black, white, yellow, brown, mix the colors all together. All people are brothers and, or let's say siblings, and Berkeley after all, and from one mother and one from one father. So, which was very inspirational. Also songs like, I'm going to leave out some of the better known songs of the Jewish left here, unfortunately, but that was a very important part of it as well. But also the partisan hymn, Zog nit kein Molad, du gehst den letzten Weg, Gott Himmel Leine, verstellen bloye Tag, al kommen wird noch unser wohlgebänkte Show, es wird erpeugt und unser Trott wir seinen da, al kommen wird noch unser wohlgebänkte Show, es wird erpeugt und unser Trott wir seinen da, von grünen Palmenland, California, von weiten Land von Schnee, wir kommen on mit unser Bein, mit unser Weg, schmuffen unser Blut, sprossen Wetter unser Wohle, unser Mut, und wann gefallen ist gestreut von unser Blut, sprossen Wetter unser Wohle, unser Mut. So steht up. Stand up when you sing this song. Thank you. Everyone who just sang along, I said, welcome to come up and sing. And finish the rest of the program. Well, I mean, Yiddish folk songs of the type of like from the beautiful root grows a beautiful tree, and from the tree comes a branch, and there's a bird on it. And I don't mean to be ironic about this. I'm just being ironic now, because you know it's all true after all. And on the branch is a bird, and from the bird comes a feather, and from the feather you make a feather bed. Oi von dem schönen Wurzel Reus, ist a schöner Bäum Reus, Bäum von dem Wurzeln von der Erde, a See was schaffen Himmel und Erde. Notice God gets left out of this one because I was taught it by Ikuf teachers, but at home we sang it with like this. Oi von dem schönen Baum Reus, ist a schöne Zweig Reus, zwei von dem Baum und nur Baum von dem Wurzel von der Erde. Oi Gott hat was schaffen, Himmel und Erde. Und also weiter. Yeah. Then there was the, what I often call my, possibly rather pretentiously, my fifth native, or seventh or something, native language.
So just for the record, this is a later song. You wrote this in the 80s, but in talking about this, we felt it would be representative of your involvement with Spanish in Los Angeles and your love for that side of the story.
Indeed, I wrote this, I went later back to live in Los Angeles, but in 1984, after I had been living in New York for several years, the thing is that I've continued to come back to California at every possible opportunity, just about, and I wrote this on an airplane, flying back to New York after the Society for Ethnomusicology conference in Santa Monica in 1984. And it's called Ciudad de mis Amores, City of My Loves. As Francesco said, a love song to LA in ranchera style. De San Fernando hasta las serras de Santana, del Valle Seco hasta las olas del mar, eres mi tierra de niñez de nacimiento, y para ti yo voy ahora a cantar. Adiós, adiós, ciudad de mis amores, adiós, adiós, ciudad de mi pasión. Ya han pasado muchos años que te llevo grabada en mi corazón. We need a little accordion playing and somebody to sing harmony too, and people maybe to shoot off some balazos con unos tragos. You know, yeah. You know what to do, my fellow Californians. Todas tus palmas, tus naranjas y tus flores se desplendan en mi alma con color. Con punto y coma, con mi pluma y mi guitarra, quiero pintar la dulzura de tu olor. Adiós, adiós, ciudad de mis amores, adiós, adiós, ciudad de mi pasión. Ya han pasado muchos años que te llevo grabada en mi corazón. Una noche en la lluvia del Lombo, un día en el sol de West LA, una noche en vuelo encima de San Pedro, por tus cariños que nunca olvidaré, por tus cañones yo me he mucho divertido, caminándome por tu chaparral. Yo soy hijo de la yuca y del arroyo, porque tú eres mi tierra natal. Adiós, adiós, ciudad de mis amores, adiós, adiós, ciudad de mi pasión. Ya han pasado muchos años que te llevo grabada en mi corazón. Hoy me encuentro en cañones de otro tipo, estoy tan lejos de las palmas de Hollywood, pero cañones de argamasa y de vidrio nunca reemplazan los de mi juventud. ¡Ay, los mitos! Órale, gracias. Muchísimas gracias. Gracias a Dios. Francesco. Pero aunque no soy hijo de la raza, y en castellano sí puedo hablar, tú mi tierra angelina muy querida, le has inspirado a este gabacho a cantar. Adiós, adiós, ciudad de mis amores, adiós, adiós, ciudad de mi pasión. Ya han pasado muchos años que te llevo grabada en mi corazón.
quasi all-American journey, because it's really also quasi not. We are moving to childhood and an important period of your life, late 60s, early 70s in Boston. A whole other set of microcultural encounters, right? We were talking about various episodes of Michael's life. He says, at some point later on, we got to Amsterdam and with friends, and I was the only one who could speak Dutch. I'm like, what do you mean you could speak Dutch? Like, yeah, of course, because I had South African friends and I learned Afrikaans, so the passage was very short from Afrikaans to Dutch. So,
I was 16.
And so I was the only one in the group who could negotiate a rental car to drive across Europe at that time because of the Afrikaans of the South Africans he grew up with, and more Japanese and then Slav. And a very important theme that emerged in talking with Michael is a radio, a clock radio. That was one of the few objects of his childhood that at some point fell. So this came from Los Angeles to Boston where he was living. Fell and instead of breaking, started picking up short waves. So, exactly. So what that meant was actually picking up all kinds of, both Voice of American, but also other stations from around the globe.
Radio Sofia, Radio Moskva, Tirana, Voice of Albania. And also, I was glued at 14. I was glued to the nightly folk music programs at 7 p.m. It was, of course, beamed at the United States, but nobody couldn't get them on a clock radio. Of Bulgarian folk music, and so that's.
So among the various influences, we discussed our. French-Canadian friends, and we'll get to that in a second, with the whole idea of a Catholic minority friendly with Jews. So always the Jewish angle is part of the equation. And bought your first guitar, American folk song, Peter, Paul and Mary, and again Russian and Yiddish songs, and then
Woody Guthrie too.
Woody Guthrie, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but of course. As you like to call it, Yugoslav music. So the whole exposure to Balkan music and repertoires, and that's a very important part of that. You talked about the Taylor's Thursday night folk dances at Cambridge Y. So a panoply of musics and cultures and languages once again. And we chose a few influences from this time of your life, a song in French-Canadian, which I cannot pronounce. I'm sorry, I went to school in Paris, it's impossible for me. I can't do that.
Francesco speaks excellent French, he's just,
Yeah, not French-Canadian, it's beyond me. And,
c'est pour l'Acadien.
And, noblesse oblige. And actually buying a record, the first record of Theodore Bickel, and listening to how Theodore Bickel was performing Yiddish songs. And we talked about it, but I haven't heard it, so I'm curious to hear this. But a Yiddish rap song you wrote about your family. So this would be so early rap. So various influences playing in this stage, and then we enter Yugoslavia and volcanic spheres.
Right. Can you repeat the question? Yes, we'll just do some of these. Yeah, one of the things, I think a theme that emerges from all of this is that for some reason I was, first of all, as Francesco has alluded to and maybe even said, or at least mentioned, I was born a generation off. My parents were really pretty much the age of the grandparents of most of my peers. This is not because they were survivors. My father had come to America long before actually still during the era from Tsarist Russia, but he was nearly 50 when I was born. My mother was in her mid-40s, 45, not an insignificant point. And particularly in my father's case, he was the youngest in his family, so my oldest aunt was born in 1892. I mean, pretty much all of my aunts and uncles were born in the 19th century, but for some reason, from a very early, just before I can remember, I was always fascinated with where they came from. And I was always drawn to the older generation of people, especially to the immigrant generation of European Jews who were part of our community, and ultimately always drawn to what we would today define as ethnicity. I mean, everybody's ethnicity, particularly to Mexican American culture. Japanese culture was something that I was a kind of disproportionate number of my friends in LA were Japanese, and I think that's a topic of a whole other talk, which is about the affinity of Jews and Japanese in 1960s Los Angeles. So at the age of 12, I moved very abruptly to Boston in New England, which is actually where my father and his family had come from Lithuania. We didn't sort of mention yet the heavy Litvak thing, but some of you know this, some of you have heard it. And I'm not talking about Litvak in the contemporary sense of, in contrast to Chassidish or Chassid, but rather to the geographical designation, Litvak as Lithuanian/Belarusian Jewish. This means we have a particular way of talking that doesn't we mumble and make everything into kind of so but upon arriving in Boston in late August of 1966, I mean, one of my first, I had been there before, and so I mean, New England was kind of the sort of the new old country that I was raised on. I had been there once to visit my family and their vast land holdings in 1961. But one of the first things I noticed was like, where are all the Mexicans, man? And through various factors, I kind of discovered that while I had very much avoided French and as a language and French culture because of its association with kind of the upper class and the kind of, as Francesco said, noblesse oblige in, I really talk that way. In Los Angeles, I got to New England, and suddenly, like, who were kind of the equivalent of Mexican Americans in New England were French Canadians, who were themselves a Catholic but strong Catholic minority and French-speaking often minority in New England. So I kind of learned French from Acadians in Waltham, Mass, where my aunt and uncle had a jewelry and appliance store. And that was really the first French that, I was like, I could get into this culture. Actually, it seems like a culture, and I guess, it's kind of about the avoidance of high culture, So yeah, I mean, songs like a very famous, one of them, I would say, the anthems of Francophone Canadians, especially Québécois. Un Canadien banni de ses foyers, parcourait implorant des pays étrangers, par dis à mes amis que je me souviens d'eux, non mais en expirant, oh mon cher Canada, mon regard languissant vers toi se portera. Mon regard languissant vers toi se portera. I mean, this is a song of French-Canadian Gaulists, French-Canadian diaspora of longing. It's a song of, I mean, possibly many of you understand. I know French is widely spoken here in the Bay Area, especially the Quebecois. So, where were we also? We were with Yugoslavia?
Yes, well, we mentioned the discovery of Theodore Bickel as the major
Right. Yeah, Theo Bickel, he appeared to me as a vision. And like through someone who was into French-Canadian culture, I erected a shrine to Theodore Bickel in the outskirts of Boston. No, in any case, it seems I have since...
well, the way we talked about this is that it gave a certain kind of legitimacy to your knowledge of Yiddish and Yiddish song, right?
Yeah, I think for a lot of us, unlike some of Jews that were more part of the Yiddishist movements that were very active in New York, including people, then young people like myself. Theo Bickel was one of the only people out there. I'm pretty much the only person out there really in the quote legit world, especially in the whole folk revival, who was doing Yiddish song and doing it as part of a rainbow of world music, decades before the term world music was coined. Yeah, I mean, just, I learned this song partly at home and partly in Shole, but, I also heard it from Theo Bickel's wonderful recording, which is actually called Jewish folk song. It's not Yiddish folk song. If you speak Yiddish, that means the same thing. Oitum steht der Bocher steht und tracht da ganz Nacht. Wenn man zu nehmen und nicht verschämen, wenn man zu nehmen und nicht verschämen. Oi tumbala, 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 laike, tumbala, 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 laike, tumbala, laike, spiel balalaike, tumbala, laike, verheilig soll sein. Okay, we'll sing the chorus the way you know it. That I realized when Soviet Jews began to arrive here that I grew up singing it the Soviet Jewish way, except for Bickel's version. Oi Mädel, Mädel, ich will bei dir verrecken, wo's geht wachsen und regen, wo's geht brennen und nie zu fern, wo's geht weinen, oi weinen und retten, oi tumbala, 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 laike, tumbala, 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 laike, tumbala, laike, spiela, laike, tumbala, laike, freira soll sein. Nach der Woche Und was darfst du verrecken? A Stein kann wachsen und erregen. Und Liebe kann brennen und nie zu fern. Aha, schönen Dank. Das hätte ich immer vergessen. A Herz kann weinen und rennen. Und tumbala, 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 laiki. Tumbala, 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 laiki. Tumbala, laiki, tumbala, laiki. Tumbala, laiki, verder soll sein. Oi, Mädel, Mädel, ich will bei dir verrecken, sollst mir der Reif an den Verbald geben. Was ist Herr von der Heus, und wo ich fliege von der Mäus. Oi, etnarischer Bocher, wo du darfst du verrecken, ich will dir der Reif an den Verbald geben. Der Reich ist von der Heus, und der Katze noch fliegt von der Heus. Und tumbala, 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 laike, tumbala, 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 laike, tumbala, laike, spiel, laike, tumbala, laike, vreden soll sein.
One could count or start counting how many layers your version of Tumbala has. You mentioned a few, but one could really deconstruct it in all kinds of ways. Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
The first foray into Europe, and the way you described it to me was sort of like one step removed from the land of origin of your family, from Eastern Europe, and a way to sort of like a slow, interesting strategy of approaching Eastern Europe, right? So early 70s, Yugoslavia, and then eventually a short stay in Poland in the 70s, framed by Boston. And then Yugoslavia will, and especially about the music, will come back in a very important way when you move back to Los Angeles in the 70s and meet the whole scene there. And they discover you, you discover, and yeah, they discover you, you discover you have a voice, you have something to say and to sing in this context. And so, do you want to sing something from that repertoire? Yeah. We're almost closing in. The strategy is...
That's actually what inspired, one of the things that main things that inspired me to attempt to play this instrument, which, but yeah, the thing is I wanted to go back to where my family came from, however, where they both came from were border areas of the Soviet Union, which were not exactly kind of, easy to get to. So when I was 16, in the summer of 1970, between my junior and senior years of high school, I set out for, even though I a high school student, I was snuck aboard an MIT charter flight to London and made my way to Yugoslavia, where I spent the summer, among other things, being a brigadier in one of the youth work brigades that had been established by the partisans at the end of the Second World War, and were still very much a part of official youth culture in Yugoslavia. And as Francesco said, I mean, it was kind of a way of getting more easily. Actually, I set out for Yugoslavia and Romania. I never made it past Yugoslavia. And frankly, I never made it to Romania until Francesco and I and a couple of friends were there in 1998. But in any case, as far as Yugoslavia, I mean, that whole connection to the music and culture of the Balkans became an extremely important part of my life. I went back and lived there for a couple of years in 72, 73, and then continued to play professionally, semi-professionally in Serbian, Croatian, Macedonian communities, who many of whom at that point thought of themselves as Yugoslavs rather than as all these separate communities, or let's say as Serbians and Croatians as well as Yugoslavs. There's a song from South Serbia, because one of the themes that we're, I think, going to uncover here is the connection between this fascination with the Balkans and Balkan music and Jewishness and Jewish culture. So this is Zapevala Sojka Tica. The owl was singing.